The most profound silence at the Family Feud studio that Tuesday afternoon came from 8-year-old Ethan Rodriguez, who communicated only through careful hand gestures and expressive dark eyes that carried the weight of someone much older. Walking through the bright corridors beside his foster parents, Maria and Carlos Santos, Ethan moved with the hyper-aware caution of a child who had learned that making noise could bring danger. His thin frame seemed to shrink inward, as if he was trying to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible, a protective mechanism that had kept him safe during the 6 months since he'd last spoken aloud. Maria Santos, Ethan's 32-year-old foster mother, kept one protective hand gently on his shoulder, careful not to startle him with sudden movements. She carried a small notebook and pen, tools that had become essential for communicating with Ethan when gestures weren't sufficient. Carlos Santos, her husband, maintained a calm, patient demeanor that had helped Ethan feel safe in their home over the past 4 months, though breakthrough moments remained frustratingly rare. The Make-A-Wish Foundation had been hesitant to arrange this request initially, concerned about whether a child who couldn't speak would be able to participate meaningfully in a game show. But Ethan had been insistent, communicating through drawings and written notes that meeting Steve Harvey was his deepest wish. His reason, written in careful 8-year-old handwriting, had been heartbreakingly simple. Steve Harvey makes people laugh without being mean. I want to remember what safe laughter sounds like. In the Family Feud green room, Ethan positioned himself in a corner chair where he could observe everything while maintaining clear sightlines to both exits, a habit that had developed during his months of hypervigilance. While other families chatted excitedly about strategy and potential questions, Ethan watched everything with the intense focus of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading adult moods and anticipating potential threats. Maria occasionally offered him snacks or drinks, communicating through the combination of gentle gestures and soft words that had become their family language. Ethan would respond with small nods or shakes of his head, his communication precise but minimal. Other families in the green room initially tried to engage him in conversation before realizing he wasn't responding verbally, leading to the kind of awkward adult exchanges that made Ethan retreat even further into his protective silence. Steve Harvey approached the Santos family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth, but something about Ethan immediately commanded his attention. In decades of hosting, Steve had developed an instinct for reading children, and there was something about this 8-year-old's profound stillness that set off every protective alarm in his system. "Well, hello there, champion," Steve said, kneeling down to Ethan's level with the careful respect he reserved for children who seemed to need extra gentleness. "What's your name, buddy?" Ethan looked directly into Steve's eyes, a moment of connection that was both intense and wordless. Instead of speaking, he pointed to himself, then used his fingers to spell out ETHAN in careful sign language letters, a skill he'd learned since losing his voice. Steve's expression shifted from confusion to understanding as Maria stepped forward to explain, "Ethan hasn't spoken in 6 months. Steve. He communicates through gestures and writing. This is his make-a-wish." "6 months?" Steve asked gently, his attention still focused on Ethan, who was watching the interaction with careful attention. "Can you tell me what happened?" Maria's expression became carefully controlled, the way adults look when they're discussing trauma within earshot of the child who experienced it. Ethan witnessed some very frightening situations in his previous home. Since then, he hasn't felt safe enough to use his voice. Steve's understanding deepened immediately. He'd worked with enough families in crisis to recognize the signs of trauma, the way children sometimes protect themselves by withdrawing into silence when words had become associated with danger. Looking at Ethan, Steve saw not a disabled child, but a child who had made the profound decision that silence was safer than speech. "Ethan," Steve said directly to the boy, "I'm really glad you're here, buddy, and I want you to know that you can communicate however feels right to you." As the family took their positions for the actual game, the production crew made accommodations that touched Steve's heart. They provided Ethan with a small whiteboard and marker, positioned at his height beside the family buzzer. They also arranged for Maria to stand close enough to help interpret his gestures if needed, though Ethan had made it clear through drawings that he wanted to participate as independently as possible. The Santos family was competing against the Miller family from Ohio, but From the opening moments, Steve found himself fascinated by Ethan's unique form of participation. When it was his turn to buzz in, Ethan moved with decisive confidence, his non-verbal communication clear and purposeful even though it was silent. During the first 2 rounds, Ethan surprised everyone with his thoughtful contributions. When Steve asked for things you might find in a kitchen, Ethan buzzed in and quickly drew a picture of a refrigerator on his whiteboard, earning the number 2 spot on the board. His artistic answers were often more creative than verbal responses, and the audience began to appreciate the unique perspective he brought to the game. Steve found himself drawn into Ethan's silent world, learning to read the boy's expressive gestures and the careful way he communicated complex ideas through drawings and simple sign language. There was something profound about the way Ethan participated fully in the game without making a sound, proving that engagement and enthusiasm didn't require voice. During a commercial break, Steve watched Ethan's behavior with growing understanding. The boy consistently positioned himself where he could see both his foster parents and the exit, a hypervigilance pattern that spoke to someone who had learned that safety required constant awareness. When crew members moved quickly or spoke loudly near him, Ethan would freeze momentarily before carefully assessing whether the activity posed a threat. Maria knelt beside Ethan, checking in with him through their established system of gentle questions and gestured responses. Steve could see the deep bond between them, the way she had learned to communicate with him on his terms rather than forcing him to adapt to a speaking world. The final round arrived with both families tied, creating genuine suspense about the outcome. Steve announced the category with his usual enthusiasm, unaware that the topic would create one of the most powerful moments in Family Feud history. "We asked 100 people," Steve declared. "What do you use your voice for?" It was Ethan's turn at the podium. He stepped forward with the careful movements that characterized all his actions, carrying his whiteboard and marker. His dark eyes met Steve's with an intensity that suggested this question carried profound personal meaning for him. Steve repeated the question, his voice unconsciously gentling as he sensed the weight this topic carried for Ethan. "What do you use your voice for?" For the first time during the entire taping, Ethan hesitated in a way that seemed different from his usual thoughtful consideration. His pause was longer, more complex, and Steve realized that this question was asking Ethan to confront the very thing he had lost, the very part of himself that he had chosen to silence for protection. Ethan looked down at his whiteboard, then at Steve, then at his foster parents. His internal struggle was visible, the conflict between wanting to participate in the game and being asked to engage with the source of his trauma. When Ethan finally began to write, his movements were slow and deliberate, each letter carefully formed as if he was crafting something important. The studio watched in complete silence as he worked, understanding that whatever he was communicating would be significant. When Ethan finally turned his whiteboard around, the words hit the studio like a physical force. "Voices hurt. Quiet is safe." The simple statement contained profound truth about trauma, about the way children protect themselves when words become associated with danger, about how silence can become both shield and prison. Steve's professional composure cracked visibly as he processed the devastating clarity of Ethan's response. "Ethan," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide, "can you tell me more about that?" Ethan wrote quickly this time, his previous hesitation giving way to a flow of communication that suggested he'd been waiting for someone to ask these questions. He turned his board around to show, shouting, "Scared me. Quiet keeps me safe." The studio audience was beginning to understand. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A child who had protected himself through silence, sharing his truth with the world, communicating profound wisdom about trauma and safety through careful, chosen words. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television production. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced everyone in the studio. "Stop everything right now." The Family Feud theme music cut out abruptly. The cameras continued recording, but every crew member understood that they were no longer producing entertainment. Steve walked away from his podium toward Ethan, his movement deliberate and protective, like someone who had just recognized a profound moment of human connection. The The studio audience watched in complete silence as Steve approached this 8-year-old who had just shared the deepest truth about his trauma through careful written words on a whiteboard. Steve knelt on the studio floor in his expensive suit, his attention completely focused on Ethan, who stood holding his whiteboard like a shield and communication tool combined. "Ethan," Steve said gently, "how long has it been since you felt safe enough to use your voice?" Ethan wrote carefully. "Voices got loud. Then bad things happened. Now I don't make noise." Steve's heart broke as he realized the full scope of what Ethan was sharing. A child who had witnessed domestic violence, who had learned that adult voices, raised in anger, preceded physical harm, who had chosen silence as his protection against a world that had proven unpredictable and dangerous. "Can you write about what happened when voices got loud?" Steve asked softly. Ethan hesitated, then wrote slowly, "Hitting, screaming, broken things. I hid and got small and quiet." The simple words painted a devastating picture of a child who had learned to survive by becoming invisible and silent, who had discovered that making no sound was safer than risking the attention that voices could bring. Steve's eyes filled with tears as he understood that Ethan's silence wasn't a limitation. It was a survival strategy that had kept him alive. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, had made millions of people laugh, had built a career on the power of voice and communication, but sitting on that studio floor with Ethan Rodriguez, he found himself confronting the reality that for some children, voices had become associated with danger rather than connection. "Ethan," Steve said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want you to know something important. There are voices that hurt, and there are voices that help. There are voices that scare, and there are voices that protect. Your foster parents' voices. Are those safe voices?" Ethan nodded immediately, then wrote, "Maria and Carlos use soft voices. They don't shout, they keep me safe." "That's right," Steve confirmed. "And does my voice feel safe to you?" Ethan considered this question seriously, studying Steve's face and body language with the careful assessment skills he'd developed. Finally, he nodded and wrote, "Your voice sounds like hugs." Steve began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments when entertainment gave way to ministry. As he wrapped the expensive garment around Ethan's small shoulders, the symbolism felt particularly powerful, a tangible reminder that some children needed extra protection from a world that had proven dangerous. "This jacket," Steve said, loud enough for everyone in the studio to hear, "belongs to the bravest person I've ever met. Someone who survived scary situations by being smart and careful and strong." Ethan pulled the jacket tight around himself, and for the first time since he'd walked onto the stage, his hypervigilant posture relaxed slightly. The jacket created a physical boundary that seemed to provide the extra security he needed to feel truly safe. "Ethan," Steve continued, "I want you to understand something. Your voice, when you're ready to use it, will be powerful and good and safe. But you get to choose when that happens. Nobody can force you to speak before you feel ready." Steve turned to address the entire studio audience, his voice carrying conviction that made everyone present understand they were witnessing something important. "This young man taught us something today," Steve announced. "He taught us that communication comes in many forms, that safety has to come before speech, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is protect yourself by being quiet." "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve declared, "we're going to do something different today. We're going to show Ethan that voices can be used for good, for celebration, for love." Everyone in this studio is going to applaud, not loudly, not scary, but gently, to show this brave young man that he's safe and loved and respected. The applause that followed was unlike any sound the Family Feud studio had ever heard. It wasn't the typical enthusiastic game show cheering, but something softer, more mindful, calibrated to demonstrate celebration without threat. 300 people clapping gently, showing Ethan that voices and sounds could express love rather than danger. As the gentle celebration continued around him, Ethan stood in the center of it all, wearing Steve's jacket-like armor, his whiteboard clutched against his chest. For the first time since arriving at the studio, he wasn't scanning for exits or assessing threats. He was simply present in a moment of safety and appreciation. Steve knelt beside him one final time. Ethan, I want you to remember something. When you're ready, not when anyone else thinks you should be ready, but when you feel ready, your voice will be here waiting for you. And when that day comes, I hope you'll call me, because I'd love to hear what you have to say. 6 months later, Steve Harvey's phone rang at an unexpected time. When he answered, he heard something that made him stop everything he was doing and sit down. "Steve," came a small, tentative voice. "This is Ethan. I'm ready to talk now." Steve's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Ethan, buddy, it's so good to hear your voice. How are you feeling?" "Scared, but safe," Ethan replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Maria and Carlos taught me that my voice is mine, and I get to choose how to use it. I want to use it to say thank you." The conversation lasted 20 minutes, with Ethan sharing stories about his progress in therapy, his growing trust in his foster family, and his gradual understanding that not all adults used voices as weapons. When they finally hung up, Steve sat in his office and cried tears of gratitude for a child who had taught him that healing happens on its own timeline, and that sometimes the most powerful sound is the sound of someone choosing to break their own silence. The episode, when it aired, became a landmark moment in discussions about childhood trauma and the importance of allowing children to heal at their own pace. Steve began incorporating Ethan's story into his work with child advocacy organizations, often saying, "An 8-year-old taught me that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's full of strength." The jacket that Steve gave Ethan became his security item during therapy sessions, a tangible reminder that he was safe and protected while he worked through his trauma. Eventually, as Ethan's voice grew stronger and his confidence returned, he decided to donate the jacket to other children who were working to find their voices again. But he kept a piece of the jacket's fabric, which he carried in his pocket, as a reminder of the day when a game show host looked past his silence and saw the courage within. And every year, on the anniversary of that Family Feud appearance, Steve receives a phone call from Ethan, not because he has to, but because he chooses to, because his voice has become his own again. Because that's what happens when an 8-year-old teaches an entire television studio that sometimes the most profound communication happens without words, and that every child deserves the time and space and safety to find their voice again when they're ready. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Because sometimes the most important sounds are the ones we choose to make, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay silent until you're ready to speak your truth.